In the last video on this channel, we took a look at what the research has to say about the most effective way to increase mobility, right? We looked at all the best available recent research showing what is the best technique to use for stretching, like is it static stretching or dynamic moving type of stretching or something fancy like PNF. We looked at the duration that you should be holding each stretch for, the intensity, the frequency that you do it per week. So if you missed that video, I'll leave a link in the description below. But that's fine and dandy to be talking about like the how, right? How have we established is the best way to stretch? But it's an entirely different question about why, right? And that's what I want to get into today, because there's a lot of misconceptions about this. Why are you stretching? And that's a question I want you to ask yourself before you start embarking on a mission to increase your mobility. But there's a lot of misconception in terms of like, are you doing it because you think it's going to reduce your risk of injury before sport? Is it because you think it's going to improve your performance in sport? Is it because you hurt your shoulder, or your back, or you have some injury and you think stretching is going to help you get over it quickly? There's a lot of different reasons why people stretch. And I don't mean to be provocative or insulting when I ask that question. I just think you need to ask yourself, why am I stretching? And that's what this video is going to talk about. Okay, so let's take a look at the many reasons why people want to improve mobility, and then we'll see what the evidence has to say about it. And just like last week, rather than cherry picking one or two studies that I like, we're going to be using studies that use meta-analysis or systematic reviews. And those are studies that sort of take a broad look at all the research and compile all the data together. So number one reason that people tend to want to stretch is because they think it's going to reduce the risk of injury before sport. And so, if you're going to go for a run or play football or soccer or whatever, you stretch before you play the sport, right? And there's been systematic reviews on this for about 25 years at least, saying, no, sorry, stretching before sport does not reduce the risk of injury during that sport. Now, this idea has been around for a long time, right? Take this paper published in 2008, where they state, the relationship between stretching and injury prevention has been substantially researched, and several systematic reviews have been conducted, with the general census showing stretching to have no positive effect on preventing injury. Here's another study, and in this paper they reviewed the available evidence on different interventions to prevent sports injuries with things like stretching and strengthening and balance training, and they concluded favorable estimates were obtained for all injury prevention measures except for stretching. And lastly, just another example, this infographic from the British Journal of Sports Medicine that states runners wishing to incorporate static stretching into their post-running routine should do so with the understanding that neither performance nor injury prevention benefit will result. Which is a great segue into the next misconception: stretching improves performance. Now, this again has been around for a long time, and no, stretching before sport does not improve performance. In fact, it may hinder performance in terms of strength and power and speed, just to a little degree, but still, it definitely does not improve performance. This 2019 paper says it succinctly with, in fact, a large body of scientific evidence has recommended not to use static stretching immediately before the performance of strength and power-related activities. This is based on evidence showing acute stretch-related declines in muscle strength and power. Another review paper that was published more than 10 years ago included this nice graph showing the longer stretches are held, the more reductions there are in strength, power, and speed-dependent tasks. So in this graph, on the vertical axis, we have reductions in performance, and on the horizontal axis at the top there, we have the duration that the stretch is held for. And as the stretch times are held longer, there's more of a reduction in the strength, power, and speed-dependent tasks. Now, I think we need to be a little careful in this area, because if your sport is like ballet or dance or gymnastics or wrestling or something, there is definitely an advantage to being more flexible, right? So we can't paint everybody with a large brush. But certain sports, let's say like running, it certainly is not advantageous to be more flexible, maybe in some muscle groups, but probably not others. In fact, runners get a surprisingly large amount of propulsive power from the elastic stretching and recoil of muscles and tendons. And research has shown that less flexible runners may actually be more efficient. However, Runners may benefit from having more flexibility in other muscle groups like the hip flexors, but the jury is still out there. All right, so stretching doesn't seem to reduce your risk of injury before sport, and it doesn't improve performance. In fact, maybe it hinders it a little bit. So then the question is, well, if I stretch before I play or if I stretch after, I'm going to be less sore the next day. This is a concept called delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS. And what the research says about that is pretty clear. The evidence from randomized studies suggests that muscle stretching, whether conducted before, after, or before and after exercise, does not produce clinically important reductions in delayed onset muscle soreness in healthy adults. So next on the list is somebody who's already injured or they have pain, right? They want to stretch to help recover from this injury. And there's a natural tendency for people when they get an injury or a pain that they want to stretch the injured body part thinking that it's going to help get them better quicker. Now, up until now, the research on these different ideas of the motivation for stretching has been pretty black and white. We know pretty well that stretching does not help those aspects. But with respect to, getting over an injury that you already have, the research is not so black and white on this. It's shades of gray in all of this. But what is black and white about this is that we don't have any evidence to say one way or the other that stretching an injured body part can help or hinder. Because there's a couple studies that say that if you do have a muscle strain and you start stretching, it's going to improve quicker. And there's other studies that say, no, that isn't true. And there's other studies that say it actually hinders it. So for example, in this network meta-analysis in 2023, they looked at 68 different studies pertaining to treatment of lower limb tendinopathy, so what used to be called tendinitis. And they said that when it comes to gluteal tendon pain, which happens to be the most common tendon pain in the lower body, they said, and stretching of the gluteal tendons should be avoided as compressive loading may exacerbate tendinopathic pain. This infographic in 2024 in the Journal of Orthopedics and Physical Therapy advises against stretching when you have a painful Achilles tendon. But I think infographics like this aren't really based on a lot of empirical evidence. It's mostly opinion-based, and yes, the researchers who publish these infographics look at all the research and they come up with this opinion on their own. But the reality is, and this is quite surprising, there isn't really a lot of studies that show stretching an injured body part can help or hurt. There just really isn't a lot of research on that topic in general, which is pretty surprising. But I think, if you have an injured body part, you're probably better off spending your time doing some strengthening on the area rather than spending your time stretching it. Okay, so now we're on to our second to last reason to stretch, and that is just for general health. People think if they stretch, they're just generally going to be healthy. And again, the research doesn't really support that idea very well. Here's a paper that stated it fairly succinctly, and they state, flexibility lacks predictive and concurrent validity value with meaningful health and performance outcomes. Consequently, it should be retired as a major component of fitness. Okay, now on to our final reason that people may want to stretch, and that's just because it feels good. And I can't argue with that. If you like stretching and you want to stretch because it feels good, knock yourself out. But you do have to keep in mind that as a whole, when you look at studies that examine the risk of injury and how it relates to flexibility, it appears to be a pretty shallow shaped curve where if you're really inflexible on the left, you're more likely to get injured. But on the other hand, if you're really overly flexible on the right, then you also increase your risk of getting injured. Now, I'll ask you this question. Who really likes to stretch? The people who are really flexible or the people who are really tight? I think we all see the people who really like to stretch are the ones who are already flexible, right? They're good at it, so they want to do it. Other people who are stiff try to avoid stretching because they stink at it. So the other caveat here would be people who are lacking function, and I can't argue with that. You should definitely be stretching if you're lacking function. So in other words, like if a woman is having trouble reaching back to hook the bra, if you're having trouble tying your shoes or putting your socks on in the morning or clipping your toenails, or like you can't see the blind spot when you're driving, you can't turn your neck that far, by all means, stretch away. Those are definitely good reasons to stretch. But this idea of like, oh, I'm gonna stretch before I play a sport to reduce my risk of injury or to improve my performance, I just don't think that's necessarily true. Again, with the caveat of like, if you're in gymnastics or ballet or wrestling, yes, you probably need that mobility for sure. But I think for most other people playing sports, if it's football or soccer or running or something like that, you'd be better off spending your time doing a dynamic warm-up to get your heart rate up and get the blood flowing and things like that than you would be with static stretching. So that wraps up these 2 videos on stretching. I hope you learned something, and if you find someone who you think may benefit, by all means, forward it on to them and press that like button and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.